have you give a warm welcome to Norman.
Thank you all for coming tonight. It's really good to be here. I first came here with my wife Peggy 15 years ago. And my mother had passed away in 1992, and her maiden name was Brumbaugh. And I determined that I was going to find out all there is to know about the first immigrant Brumbaugh to arrive in Philadelphia in 1750, and that was Jacob, who then went from Philadelphia quickly to the Hagerstown area and lived a full life getting into everything that happened in the area between 1753 and 1799. He died the same year as George Washington, and there's some controversy about whether they met. When I was here 15 years ago, I had the good luck to meet John Clinton Fry, who told me where Jacob's burial place was. And Peggy and I went out there, and it was August. And the cornfield was this high. I was determined to get into the middle of the cornfield and see this cemetery. Peggy almost lost me in the cornfield. I struggled to get out. Came back in January. I learned a little bit about farming. And when I was here, so I met John Clinton Fry, I met Patricia Schnebley, who had written about many of the old houses in Washington County, but not the one that was #1 on Maryland Historical Trust's most endangered list of historic properties in 2010. And that was the Brumbaugh Kendall Grove farmstead. That really hit me. I thought, this must be a pretty important guy. But you couldn't always tell that. And preparing this talk, and also an article for next year's Maryland Historical Magazine on Jacob, I got a little bit of help from Dr. Ed Pacifist, the former archivist of Maryland. So I was pretty lucky. I have to remember to do that. Some of the typography is a little different from the way it was when I put it together because of different generations of computers. So I hope we'll get over that somehow. But it says, Jacob's birth in German lands. And he began life as Johann Jacob Brumbaugh. Between 2 and 3 a.m., these German records are very precise, on the morning of February 8th, 1726, in a little village called Osthelden, or eastern slope of the mountain. And it's near Siegen, S-I-E-G-E-N, in Westphalia, and it's about 50 miles from the Rhine River. It's on the right side. And this coming February will be the 300th anniversary of his birth, the tricentennial of Jacob Brumbaugh. The area of his German home had a scarcity of land. Most everywhere in Germany had that because they had so many sons to take the land. And they had recently passed laws against conventicles. I never heard that term before, but it's Christians praying in groups at home instead of in a proper church. Some people didn't like that. They thought they were separatists or they were doing something heretical. And his village was also notable for the presence of several Mennonite groups who had been driven out of Zurich, Switzerland. Mennonites were known then for their advanced agricultural techniques, crop rotation, pasture management, fertilizing. At 24 years of age, Jacob chose to emigrate to America. He could have gone to Russia east, or he could have gone to America. Fortunately, he went to the right place. He went down the Rhine to Rotterdam and found passage on a ship called Nancy to Philadelphia, arriving on the 31st day of August, 1750. He traveled alone. He didn't have a family with him, as many Germans emigrating did. But by family lore, he is described as large in stature, strong in constitution, and hard of hearing. Upon arrival, he carried all that way 50 pounds sterling in his pocket. He could have been set upon by thieves. Any number of things could have happened. This was a considerable sum, equal to 4 years of pay for a British soldier in those days. £1 a month. In Philadelphia, they asked him to sign an oath to the British king and to the authorities of William Penn's proprietary colony. Here's his signature on the oath, right there. And here's the second page of the ship's list, which had 78 people, and you see down near the bottom with the red arrow is his signature. You could still find that ship's list in the Pennsylvania archives. Jacob's religious affiliation with the German Baptist Brethren deeply influenced his life. The Brethren originated in Schwarzenau, just 36 miles from his village of origin, and they sought to emulate the earliest Christians. Purity of thought and purity of service to the Lord. He was part of a very gentle little wave of brethren emigrating to Philadelphia and some on to Maryland. Adult male brethren were prohibited from shaving their beards. A letter in the Philadelphia archive of Henry Drinker, a Quaker merchant. I read a letter he wrote to a lawyer in Richard Potts in this area, who was going to collect some money from Jacob, and he says, here's what he looks like. He's a bearded German. And usually a bearded German was a sectarian. If you were clean shaven, you probably went to the Reformed or the Lutheran church. According to a recent biography of Henry Drinker, the Quaker merchant, he preferred to sell land on credit to such farmers like Jacob because they were hardworking, pacifists like the Quakers, and good credit risks. The brethren neither would sign oaths of allegiance, nor would they, let me go back. Nope. They would neither bear arms nor sign oaths of allegiance. It is said that they displayed a martyrological mentality. That means they were prepared to suffer for their faith as they had in their homeland, where they were constantly persecuted and in hiding. The most salient tenet of the Brethren faith was adult or believer's baptism by full body immersion in flowing water, often quite cold. The minister would dunk them 3 times forward for total immersion while they confessed belief in God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And often, as in this picture, you'll see people on the sidelines. Well, they could be co-religionists, but over here where the dogs are, there could be non-believers in this full body immersion who were making fun. They thought this was funny. This sacred ritual of the brethren was viewed with derision by some. And here's another picture of Dunker adult baptism. Oh, I'm sorry. There you go. This is a page from a 1790 book on the Baptists in early North America by Morgan Edwards. And in effect, it says, yeah, they were called dunkers, like putting a donut in your coffee, dunking it. So another example of how they made fun of the dunkers. Aha. Did I do twice then? Okay. Yeah. Okay. In the 1750s, he arrived in Hagerstown in 1753 when he first bought a piece of real estate of 90 acres. And by 1765, he had 800 acres. So what did he do in the 1750s besides work his 90-some, 100-some acres as he acquired more? He acted as a scout under Captain Jonathan Hager, a good guy to know, the town founder. And he was later the first German immigrant elected to the Maryland legislature. So he became a bridge of the German settlement to the dominant English, Scots-Irish population of the area. Jacob served, according to family lore, as a packman, or he served as one who would take care of the sick and the wounded on the expedition. His religious convictions not permitting him to bear arms. So even in the 1750s, before he married Mary Angle, who had been a convert to the Brethren, he was acting as a pacifist. So it's hard to say when exactly he became a Brethren, because there are no lists of Brethren churches. So here's the Brumbaugh myth that other people were saying. 2 or 3 Brethren historians in the 20th century, in the 1930s and the 1960s, said this guy Jacob Brumbaugh was really something because he nursed Washington back to health on the Braddock expedition. Well, did he cite any evidence for that? No. So we got to look askance at it, and there are a lot of myths about where Washington slept, as we know, and where he ate. But it turns out he was frequently in Maryland because he couldn't get to Philadelphia except through Maryland. So he was around a lot. But on the Braddock expedition, he served as an aide to Braddock, but for 8 days before July 2nd, he was sick as a dog. He was carried in a litter, and someone nursed him. He wrote to his brother, John Augustine Washington, and said, not only was I sick, but my assistant was sick too, with the same thing. He was useless to me, and I had to pay a nurse to attend upon me for 8 days. I paid him 8 shillings. And it's in his account book. So we know he was sick, and we know he had to pay a nurse. But did he name the nurse? No. Anyway, so I was wondering, how can we figure that one out? Well, it turns out in 1756, he wrote a letter to the governor of Virginia. He dropped in this phrase, all Dunkers are doctors. As if, maybe he had experienced a Dunker doctor. So I think if he was nursed by somebody, it was a damn good chance it was a Dunker. Because when Benjamin Franklin had advertised for the supply train for Braddock, he got all the pacifists, the non-enrollers, who later pacifists, to get in the supply chain because they saw British specie at the end of this. So there were a lot of Dunkers and Mennonites and Amish on that supply train. Anyway, Washington also knew about the Eckerlin brothers who came out of Ephrata Cloister out near Lancaster. And that was rather an offshoot. And they were taking care of the Indians in the area medically. So George Washington knew a fair amount about the brethren and their qualities. So I think there's something there. But anyway, it's all circumstantial evidence and it's inconclusive, so we can't at all say it happened. But there might be a clue later on. So this is the account in 1938 of J. Maurice Henry, a PhD professor at Bridgewater College, who wrote about Jacob Brumbaugh, the Pathfinder, and lauded what a model farmer he was, and how not only Braddock, but Washington stayed overnight at Jacob's farm. So, could be, but there's no proof. So, also in the 1750s, he kept adding to his farm. And by 1765, he had 788, about 800 acres. That's a pretty darn big farm. In this neighborhood of northern Hagerstown, the average farm was about 200 acres or less. And there were certainly a lot of Germans there. But he obviously, he rose above the average farmer. He was taking on a really big job. So what were his occupations? By this time, we know he was a weaver when he arrived from Germany. He became a grain farmer. He raised livestock on the farm, which put him above some of the other farmers too, because just growing wheat is fine, but to add livestock, you've got a lot more commercial activity. He was a distiller of whiskey and apple brandy. He died with 400 gallons of whiskey. And he was a scout for soldiers. And he was a wagon maker and became a landowner in 2 states. Did I say wagon maker? Well, here in the 1911 Baltimore Sun, he carried a photograph of the Brumbaugh family Conestoga wagon. Wow. And they estimated that it had been built around 1790 when Jacob was still alive. So I kind of think, that's circumstantial evidence that maybe he was a wagon maker as well. So the men who worked on the archeological dig in recent years found that photograph. Now we come to the Revolutionary period. This is the most important period, the most distressing period, and in September, let me start with in August of 1775. Colonel John Stull wrote to Colonel Samuel Beall at the Maryland Convention to say that the local boys who were joining the militia were pretty angered because the pacifists weren't turning out for the militia. And they were prepared to go to the pacifist homes and turn them out of their homes. They were really upset. And he said it would be better if there was a fine for the Dunkers and Mennonites. And even the Mennonites and Dunkers, he said, agreed. Now, why would they agree? According to their faith, they couldn't volunteer money to the war, to the government. But if they were required to pay it, that's okay. So there is some sense of that. And this committee of observation was the full government for at least a year and a half. And they were the sheriff, they were the commander of the military, they were the judge and jury. You couldn't even bring a lawsuit unless you got permission from them. And they didn't give it easily. They also were there to collect supplies for the Continental Army, including, in particular, blankets, wagon cloths, and graves. On April the 6th, 1776, they said, bring your blankets to the church if you can, I think the Zion Church, if you can bring some, if you have any to spare, and that's for the troops. Jacob arrived, he had 2 blankets. I think maybe he might have been signaling that even though I'm a pacifist, I want to help somehow. And so they were highly valued, these blankets as well. It's about 28 shillings between the 2 of them. And then the committee sent out a summons to all those who had not enrolled. In other words, mostly the Mennonites and the Dunkers, because they were pacifists, but there may have been some others, but most of them were Mennonites and Dunkers. And they said, come show cause why you should not be fined for not coming to the militia. Tell us if you have some exemption from serving or something. And some of them did. Maryland had long had an exemption for the religiously scrupulous of bearing arms. A nice little term for pacifists. And some would come and tell them about that. If you didn't come to the meeting, you could be treated pretty harshly because they were on a short fuse. And they could be pretty withering. They spent all day interviewing 116 of these non-enrollers, and it's in the minutes of the Committee of Observation. This is at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. There's a bound book of about 120 pages of the minutes of the Committee of Observation. And it's an awesome thing to see, I have to tell you. I spent a morning with it, with Peggy in August. And when they brought out this book, I practically fainted because I thought they were going to show me a microfilm. You know how to read those, and you go blind. So they brought out the full book, and I was able to see it. You see this beautiful script beginning 14 September 1775. And then in November 6th of 1775, Jonathan Hager got hit by lightning or something while he was helping to build the church. Here was this guy who'd been there since 1736, I think, and had built the lots of Hagerstown and sold them, and owned much property, and had his own family. His wife had died a couple of years earlier, so he first called Hagerstown Elizabethtown. And so that was a big blow to the community, no matter what else happened. But it was also particularly bad because the German community was left without their leader to deal with the English and the Scots-Irish who mainly settled this area. So this is the members, some of the members of the committee. And as you see, they were a miller, a distiller, an ironmaster, a cooper, surveyor, trader, et cetera, et cetera. There were, what I like to say, a level playing field. There were no wealthy aristocrats. There were no wealthy lawyers like Daniel Delaney or Charles Carroll of Carrollton or all those fancy people. There was just regular people here in Washington County. And so they were sort of on the same level. And I imagine Jacob had already been there 25 years. So I imagine he was a pretty established farmer, well known for those qualities that he seemed to have. And but Brethren didn't like to serve in government. So he would never have accepted a job on the committee. You know why? Because people in government often have to force somebody to do something, to take some action. And they don't like that. That's against their principles. So here's Jacob's signature, Jacob's name put by the clerk of giving 2 blankets on April the 6th, valued at 28 pounds. Come on now. And this is what happened on May 7th, when they commanded all the non-enrollers to come, and they interviewed them for an entire day. And the next day they wrote up the minutes. And there's Jacob Brumbaugh, 50 years, it said. So he said, sorry guys, the draft is 16 to 50, I'm over 50. Well, can we see your birth certificate? Who had a birth certificate back then? He may have it, but I don't know. I doubt it. I think they just believed him because he'd been there 25 years and he hadn't been a scoundrel. That's my theory. It also says a gun to Captain Sellers. Captain John Sellers was head of one of the companies, and by gun they mean a long rifle. They said you can keep your pistol. I suppose that's in case they have to kill a horse that's broken a leg, for household needs, whatever that might be. So they allowed them to keep pistols. And then later they said, give us all your wagon cloths. The big cloth over the top of the hoops of the Conestoga wagon, because they needed them for the supply wagons for the Continental Army. About this time in 1776, some of the Germans who were not pacifists got together and formed 2 companies, and the Washington County Committee of Observation sent them on to the fight because they had volunteered. And sort of this might have shown a harsh light on the Germans who didn't volunteer. So that could have been tough. In 1780, Jacob sold grains to Dr. Henry Schnebley, who was his next door neighbor. He immigrated from Switzerland, and right about, where is Jacob? Jacob Brumbaugh. March the 8th, he sold 6 bushels of wheat and 4 bushels of rye for 184 pounds, and even selling supplies to the Continental Army was an act of patriotism. According to the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution, and the Society of the Sons of the American Revolution today. So for giving 2 blankets and for selling grains, and thirdly, for paying the Maryland supply tax in 1783, any one of these would give the ancestor status as someone who had provided for the cause of independence directly, by direct assistance. And these were important things. And I think Schnebley gave them that written receipt so they could keep that and have it later to show that they did sell supplies to the Continental Army. Schnebley was the agent for the Continental Army. He was a lot of things. He was a doctor as well and a large landowner. Jacob also had no enslaved persons, either in 1783 or at his death in 1799. Some of the sectarians were pretty good about that. Some weren't. Certainly a lot of his neighbors had slaves in this area.
Yes, sir.
And Jacob did not. So when Governor Dunmore in Virginia said, any enslaved persons who want to come over to the British, will free you, Jacob didn't have to worry that his guys would sneak across the line in Virginia and get that freedom from slavery. His 2 Brumbaugh cousins, who were also on those previous lists, they were listed as Jacob Jr. and John Brumbaugh. Now, my Jacob had 2 sons of that name, but they were born late in the 1760s and wouldn't have been 16 by the time of this. So I think that they are the sons, the eldest sons of one of his cousins who lived in the Antietam area, a man named Johannes Hendrik Brumbaugh, from 1 mile from where Jacob's village was in Germany. So they were definitely related. He's been described as a 4th cousin. He had 4 sons: Conrad, John the stump weaver, the stocking weaver, George, called Garrick, and Jacob, called Jockle. Those 4 are often confused with Jacob Brumbaugh. It's a different family. They're cousins. They're related. They're 4th cousins, pretty good remote cousins, but they were so close living to where he lived, where Jacob lived. So, and I do believe there's evidence of the 2 families going looking for property in Bedford County, Pennsylvania. So I think they may have gone together. And I think because these younger ones had to pay fines 2 times, 3 pounds each, I think they probably migrated up to Bedford County a little earlier, so as not have to pay any more. Anyway, there are muster rolls for some companies of soldiers here in Washington County where the Brumbaughs are listed, including Jacob. But as you learn when you're researching a brethren ancestor that you know was a member of the German Baptist Brethren, you also have to prove not only is he on the eligible list, but he also really served, and here's how we know it. in order to get Patriot status. So also during the Revolution, it's key to know that Dunkers and Mennonists cooperated with other pacifists here during the war. Quakers, Moravians, Schwenkfelders, Amish, etc. They were prepared to suffer. They had a publisher, Christopher Sauer, in Germantown outside of Philadelphia, and he published a German language newspaper ever since, I don't know, the 1720s. So he was very well known, very friendly with the Brethren and the Mennonites. And, but he was not one of them. His son, Christopher Sauer II, became a bishop in the Brethren Church, and his grandson, Christopher Sauer III, became a publisher, but he went over to the Tories.
Oh.
He went to New York, where you could be with the British, and he sent letters to Germans enticing them to come work for the British. So he caused his father a lot of anguish. His father was arrested, stripped naked, made to walk 15 miles to Valley Forge, where George Washington took a look at him and said, "Send that guy away." It was very sad. They were making fun of him, and they confiscated his printing press, which was exceedingly valuable. He was a very rich man, but they confiscated everything he had, all the books, and they sold it at auction for the benefit of the troops. So it was a big deal because it was a 3-generation printing dynasty here in the colonies, and it did a lot of good work. So they got together, the Mennonists, as we call them, or Mennonites, and the Dunkers, or the Brethren, in 2 instances to produce petitions to the Committee of Observation of Washington County. The first was in 1775, and we don't have a copy of it, but we think it probably looked exactly like the short and sincere declaration that the Dunkers and Mennonites of Pennsylvania had produced for the Assembly or the Legislature of Pennsylvania in November of 1775. And it said a lot of things. We're prepared to help any man, to give him thirst, give him drink if he is thirsty, give him food if he is hungry, but we cannot take anyone's lives, and we only can help preserve life. And then they produced a second petition in late 1776. They said, "Would you please indulge us with taking our produce in lieu of paying specie money," which was hard to find, for their fines. And the local committee pretty much said, "That sounds reasonable to us." But they said, "We got to send it to Maryland, to Annapolis." And Annapolis came back and said, "No, we don't have time for that." So they had a tough job to do, to weigh the possibilities. And what I think is that the government of Washington County was fair-minded, was balanced, even though they called the Brethren Dunkards, like drunkards. It wasn't very nice, a little nastier than Dunkers. But in the end, they were relatively fair with the pacifists of Washington County. So the thrust of it is that during the Revolution, the Dunkards and Mennonists had to give up their guns, their long rifles, and their wagon cloths to the committee. And they were charged with this. The committee said, there are a lot of families that are needy around here because their fathers, brothers, and husbands are away at the war. And they should be able to apply to inquire of their local Mennonite or Dunker for any assistance they need, and you provide it. And if we hear you don't, there will be harsher penalties, I promise. So they were strict. They were not mean about it, but they were strict. And that was the charge for the next, 7 years. I think Jacob and his kind had to provide any assistance that people needed on the home front, because a lot of people were without the main economic engine and the main driver of the families. Now, post-war, what happened? Well, we found that over in Pennsylvania, the Mennonites and the Dunkers were dumped on. Because the Continental Congress and the authorities of Pennsylvania had exiled to Virginia 17 of the leading Quakers in Philadelphia, who were the leaders of their faith, with no accusations of any wrongdoing, but suspicion that they were corresponding with the enemy. They had sent them away from their families 200 miles to this little place in Winchester, which at the time had barracks for prisoners of war, POWs, who were Hessians as well as English, but mostly Hessians. And they didn't put the Quakers with the Hessians. The Quakers, who were some of the wealthiest men in Philadelphia, could lodge themselves and have dinner any place they wanted at their own expense. Because this had happened, and it was a very public banishment from Philadelphia, people in the local rural counties of Chester, Montgomery, Bucks, Lancaster, etc., thought they had permission to persecute their local Mennonites and Dunkers and Schweigfelders and Moravians. Although the Moravians had a saving grace, Washington said the wounded can go to Bethlehem or to Lidditz and also to Ephrata, and they would be taken care of, the wounded from the Battle of Brandywine. And so those pacifists were giving up their lives, many of them, nursing the sick and wounded, because there was a lot of camp disease, you know how it goes with army camps. So in Pennsylvania, you had this public humiliation of the Quakers, and then the local bullies got on top of their local Mennonites and Dunkers. So there was a lot of persecution. They even would send people out who pretended they were trying to get to British lines. And, oh, could you give me some food or some drink? And the Mennonites and Dunkers would do that. And then somebody would come and say, giving succor to the enemy, huh? And so they even had straw men do that so that they could collect the extra 10 pounds reward for catching a treasonous person. So anyway, Pennsylvania was pretty rife with this kind of strife, which I got to tell you, as far as I know, did not happen in Washington County. So after the war, the question was, would Jacob be persecuted since he refused to bear arms along with his friends, or would he be tolerated and welcomed back into the community because maybe the Dunkers and Mennonites had done a good job during the war of taking care of families and stuff? I found the record of great commercial success at farming for Jacob. He had very low expenses. He had 6 sons and 1 daughter. And he had a very frugal nature. His domestic economy accounted for much of his success. He raised livestock, and that was a plus in addition to the grains. His orchard was a plus. It was either apples or perhaps peaches. He made his own drink on the farm, so he didn't have to buy anything. He made his own medicines on the farm. How do we know this? Because the archeological dig that was performed in 2017, which I'll talk about later, could find traces of all this in the soil. They went over 1,600 shards of glass, water, metal, bone that was in the yard and performed analyses, and unbelievable. He sold his choicest meats to the customers, and he kept the secondary meats to eat at home. Another frugality. He had 2 copper stills. As I said, he died with over 400 gallons of whiskey and apple brandy. He had good soil, hard work, and after the revolution was over, there was a strong market for grains. Some of the European countries needed bread and flour, and some of it was shipped from Baltimore abroad, as well as throughout the colonies. They said that wheat was king in the post-war world. So I think Brumbaugh had a really good commercial time. He began to prepare his legacy. In 1786, he was 60 years old. He and Mary had 7 children. Jacob wanted to secure a good future to his children, as we do today. Wheat prices rose. He kept expenses low, and he sent more loads to Baltimore to ship out. And you know what? He went north. He had heard about Morrison's Cove in Bedford County, 80 miles northwest of Hagerstown. Because when it came wheat harvest time in August, I think, the backwooders from Bedford County would come down here and help harvest the wheat, and then go back home when their harvest was coming. So the people down here knew this beautiful plain. This shows the beautiful farmland available here, and this is Brumbaugh Road, and this is Brumbaugh Mountain. And when Peggy and I drove up there, I just about popped my eyes. Couldn't believe it. Because it was not only Jacob and some of his family, but also this 4th cousin and all these other Brumbaughs. So I think that led to making a big deal of it up there in Bedford County. This shows a tax list from 1786, where Brumbaugh had 3 lots, and but it's called non-residenters. So he didn't say he was a resident of Pennsylvania. He said he was still a resident of Washington County, Maryland. That was his home. And that was the farm where he had, by that time, 900 acres. He bought 3 land tracts in Bedford County from Philadelphia Quaker elite transatlantic merchant Henry Drinker. By merchant, I don't mean he had a shop. This guy owned several ships that would go out to the West Indies, to London, back to here, and this was major business. And Henry Drinker was one of the richest Philadelphia Quakers. And how do I know that bought the land tracts? Well, you can find the records both in Pennsylvania and Maryland, of land transactions at that time. It's not hard. But I also know that on August 23rd, 1803, after Jacob was 4 years dead, his son, Jacob Jr., came to Philadelphia, knocked on the drinker's door and said, I have some money to pay to Henry Drinker, because his father had left 234 pounds due on the land tract that he had bought. He paid a down payment, but he hadn't paid the rest. And so Jacob Jr. went all the way to Philadelphia. Now, how do I know that? Well, Elizabeth Drinker was a famous diary keeper. For 49 years, she kept a faithful daily diary, including all these years of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. And on page 1677 of her now published diary, which is 3 volumes of 2,200 pages, she recounts that Jacob Brumbaugh came to pay money to Henry. And then you see in Henry's account books, here's where Henry accounts for the land on Yellow Creek received of Jacob Brumbaugh, which I have it read shall be in full. The 23rd of August, 234 pounds, 7 shillings and 6 pence. So these kind of documents are wonderful to find. And when I went looking for this document, I also found 3 letters that Jacob Brumbaugh had sent to Henry regarding these transactions. And they were the first pieces of correspondence of Jacob, and the only that I've ever seen. And I thought to myself, wow, that's his handwriting. And then I realized, maybe not, because 3 letters, they all look like a different hand. So what I think happened was, with many German immigrants, they went to the schoolmaster and said, can I get you to write a letter for me? I'll tell you about it, and we'll talk about what to say, and that he had they're too neat. Some of them are too neat, and they're different. So to me, he was literate, but he wasn't a Nobel Prize in Literature. So it was John Clinton Fry who sent me out to Maryland 11 north of Hagerstown, where it bumps out there and in that cornfield. And this is when I came back in January, obviously, because in August it couldn't be seen. And there's the farm in the background that's now been demolished. And this is a grave marker that was placed there by his descendants in the 20th century. That's why it looks so new. So it was probably around 1950 or so. Someone got this together.
To keep that from being
And,
demolished and lost.
I just think it's great.
Yeah.
The fact that the date of birth, year of birth was really 1726, it's not a big deal. But that's the grave marker you'll find if you go there. Jacob's achievements. Oh, I didn't mention. Mason and Dixon came through his backyard. I mean, who could imagine that anything that happened in this area, Jacob had a hand in.
Yeah, that's normal.
So he developed a big family, 7 children, 25 grandchildren when he died. He had a neighborhood of friendly people. He made support for his country, and he's a true Washington County patriot. He had agricultural success. He bought at least 7 more farms before he died. Now, why did he do that? His children, especially his boys, were late teens, early 20s, and maybe up to 30 when he died. And if he just had cash in the mattress, what do you think he thought would happen to that?
First one.
I don't know. I'm just guessing now. But he spent 15 years traveling up to Bedford County, buying at least 7 farms of 200 or 300 acres each. And he was trying to put it in the asset class that he knew best, farms. And any of my children could earn a living for their family off these farms. But if the money was too easy come, easy
I
go,
was thinking of that.
might not have happened. So anyway, that's my theory. He held no enslaved person, but I gotta say, within 6 months of his death, most of his sons in the Hagerstown area had enslaved persons that they owned. Terrible thing to say, but that's the way it was. And we regret to learn it, but we look for ways to overcome those kind of things. He also, in the inventory of his house, it said he had 16 wooden benches and a table on the 2nd floor. And sometimes they had a separate entrance to the house, and he would hold home church in that place. To have 16 wooden benches meant that, maybe you're just entertaining people generally, but if you were a dunker, it was probably a home church. He had material wealth, but he had it in farmland, not in cash. He had what I call the American dream for a dunker. He left children to help populate the congregations of the Brethren churches. 3 of his 7 kept with the faith, and he each of his children had about $1,000 inheritance plus 400 acres. So they were well provided for, and I've done pretty thorough searches of all 7 of them, and I think they led a relatively affluent life. George became a county commissioner and the clerk for the borough of Hagerstown, and Henry became a farmer, and one of them became a dunker minister up in Bedford County, et cetera, et cetera. They had good lives. It was, it's no small part to their father's inheritance.
Oh, yeah, wow.
So Jacob is recognized now, since 1912, by the Patriot, as a patriot. He gave direct assistance to the cause of independence. Now, the good thing is Maryland has the Maryland Historical Trust. And when they learned that Jacob's property would qualify for a place on the National Register of Historic Houses, they realized that they could go to the airport and say, listen, if you ever demolish that thing, you've got to promise to do an archeological dig there so that we can learn our history and our culture from those resources that they discovered there. And it is a wonderful thing. There was a team of 10, 3 PhDs, 6 master's degrees, and it was monitored by the Maryland Historic Trust. And it's 586 pages long, and it's available here at the library. And it's just an amazing thing. I can't say I read every page because some of it's pretty dry and hard to understand. But I read enough to know that they can find out a lot of information. Now, in the dig, they said, there's this one button that we found. It's called a shank button, so that on the back it has a loop where you can put thread through it and put it on your coat. And what did it say on it? Long live the president. G.W. George Washington. And these are the 13 colonies, each of their initials linked by a chain. This was produced around April 30th, 1789, when Washington held up his hand and said he would defend the Constitution in New York City. New York was the capital for about a year and a half. Then it came back to Philadelphia. Oh, it was in Princeton for a while. Then came back to Philadelphia and eventually ended up in Washington, D.C. So this is one of the things they found in the backyard. And the archaeologists said someone wanted to make a statement by wearing the button like that right there. Well, in a way, what it says is the brethren came to be integrated into the new republic and were accepted as true Americans. They had done what they were supposed to do during the war. They didn't go against their faith, but they did what the committee said, and they're integrated into the new republic. It's also another circumstantial and inconclusive piece of evidence that maybe Jacob did make contact with George Washington during that Patriot expedition. It's not unheard of, but I thought it was pretty darn cool.
That is really cool.
Do you know how many of those were made?
So I looked on websites for inauguration button, and a couple of years ago, the Etsy people made replicas. And so I got some, and I'd like to present one to the Washington County Historical Society because it's a little cleaned up. It looks better, looks easy to read, and there it is. So he was a Patriot, husband, father, grandfather, and my fourth great grandfather. And some other people over here are also descendants of Jacob. And February 8th will be his 300th anniversary, his tricentennial. So maybe you'll raise a toast that day. to Jacob Brumbaugh. Thank you for listening. I can take as many questions as you have. Yes, sir.
My first question is, I like how you touched on the Mason Dixon line, but when you look at the history of this country from the Statue of Liberty perspective in the 1700s, you had to think of like into the 1800s, you had to think of the nature of the time. All over British are coming, the British are coming. Patrick, can we give me a liberty or give me death? When you look at the history, the true history of this country was messed up. But that's why it's called history. You can learn something. So I like what you said about like, the Mason Dixon line, if anybody has about Pennsylvania, knows when these things were the Blazers. So when you learn history, you kind of like, just have to learn that history, whether it's Western civilization, when you're not on American history. I had professional classes. That's what the real knowledge, all they copy is powerful, really is knowledge.
Well, these people are the original conscientious objectors. We had them in the 20th century, in the First World War, Second World War, even the Vietnam War. Sometimes they were treated relatively well, sometimes they weren't treated well at all. And it's a very controversial subject because anytime there's a war, pacifists are on a hot seat, and it's very difficult. And so I wrote my book in 2023 about the Quaker exile, which was really quite an interesting thing. And I have some books I can leave at the library when I come tomorrow. If anybody wants to have one. Yes, sir.
Where in Bedford, what is Brumbaugh near in Bedford County? I'm fairly familiar with Bedford County, but.
It's the northernmost part, Woodbury Township.
Okay, that's why I don't know. My uncle had a 100-acre dairy farm in the middle of Bedford County.
Uh-huh.
And of course, Bedford County at that time encompassed Somerset County to the west. And there was a big group of Brethren
There
people
were.
in the mountains in Berlin.
Brothers Valley.
Yes.
Brothers Valley, yes.
Yeah.
It's still called that, by the way.
Yeah,
Right?
and some Brumbaughs may have gone there too.
Yeah, and that's, my ancestors went from Lancaster County to Brothers Valley
Right,
area.
right. And among the,
And there's threads, again, of things you like, George Adam Martin, there's threads of continuity there
Right.
between your story and
right,
ours.
right, right. And among the brethren in the area and those were Studebakers.
Yes,
Yes.
And I think Weyerhaeuser or some
Yeah.
other name like that.
my great-grandmother, not on my name side, but married my great-grandfather, was connected to the Studebakers. And one of them wound up in Indiana and all that stuff, yeah.
Yes, sir.
I had a question. I married into a family and their name was Grove, and I heard Grove mentioned.
Yeah.
Now, she was sixth direct descendant from Keedysville, and he was a circus rider. And that was that little church in Keedysville.
Uh-huh.
Was there any connection at all? Because I mean, I know the Dunker Church was, of course, there in Battleville.
Right, yeah.
Have you-
I don't know of any connection, but the Groves got the farm around
You know, there's a Grove Farm Church.
1880 or something up to maybe 1912.
Yeah, that was all Sharpsburg and up there.
Yeah.
And then there was, they married into Wilson, which that was on the store there during the battle. And Peter.
I have another question. When you look at history, right, from a historical perspective, I read a book once called Guns, Germs, and Steel, and it talks about by Jared Diamond, and it talks about in the book like the coming of the country. What I mean is like you talk about the farm, then the field, then the farm, then we talk about the labor, and bigger, it really helps throughout.
Can I hear the question?
Well, when you look at the history, it's I like how your mind works all the way, and I appreciate your sagacity.
And I don't think people can hear the question.
It's hard
You
for people
want
to
to
hear
take the
the question.
microphone to ask the question so the audience can hear?
I don't want to.
Is there a question?
Can you hear?
It's very loud.
Turn around.
Okay. So when you look at so when you look at the history of this country, right? I read a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. Jareddiamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Guns, Germs, and Steel. So in the book, it talks about like you're talking about the farmlands and basically when you're in the 1700s and Benjamin Franklin being like everything leading up till now. So when you look at the true history of this country, you look at genealogy, lineage, ancestry, my whole family's me. So when you look at the true history of the country, in the beginning of the country, you see the sagacity, your mind, how it works, the philosophical, the poetical history. So when we're looking at the history, what I'm getting at is, okay, like you said, you can have somebody in there, but you might be a descendant of one. No, I could have something on my side of my family, my mother's side. My Aunt Kathy and Uncle Don have a place on Civil War property right over here on Frederick Street in my family, and there's an historical landmark out front. So that's one reason why when you look at history, it's not just passing somebody's class, it's like the bigger picture of history. And I think in order to learn history in Western civilization, which means European domination of world history, which I take and transfer, I have that because so when you look at history and have an appreciation for learning history and capitalizing on it, that's where I think that we're going to be able to change the future. So I think when you look at this stuff, it's good because now we're really understanding what's going on. So we're not left in the dark.
Right, right. If you don't learn the lesson one way, you'll learn it another. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Who also here is related to Mr. Brumbaugh?
Yeah, how many people are related to Brumbaugh? Wow. Oh, my God.
Great.
You have a reunion.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, man.
Well.
Related, just raise your hand.
No, no.
Thank you so much.
He's our fifth great grandson.
Oh, that's great. That's terrific. Yeah.
So does that go with more?
Yes.
So any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I guess
guess I was one of the myth believers, because I was doing research and I thought I saw an article that was written by George Washington, and he named Johann Jacob Brumbaugh.
Wow.
It is over here in the Western Maryland. I'm gonna have to go back and check that.
Well, there are books by J. Maurice Henry and Freeman Ankrum, and then there's one about the Brothers Valley in Somerset County. And they all mention the legend of Jacob Brumbaugh as a model farmer, number one, and secondly, nursing Washington back to health. I wish he's given me more clues.
Well, I just thought it
Yes,
was
sir.
a reference to
You-
George
that-
Washington's journal.
That's after the beginning of the French and Indian War when Washington, so it's on the way back that he was sick,
No,
On the way
it was
out.
on the way out.
on the way out.
On the way out, they were ambushed on July 9. This was up till July 2, the 10th, the 8 days before that.
Yeah, that started the French and Indian War.
Exactly. Exactly.
James Fillmore Cooper, last
Yeah.
name, classic.
That's, you can say that. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.